All right, this next session is going to talk about what we talk about and who we talk about it with. Miles O'Brien, many of you know him, a space correspondent. He had a line at some point, and he said, "NASA's the best story never told," and it's not the case that NASA does a bad job. They do a fantastic job. They win countless awards, things like that. But regardless, you still have people out there saying, "Oh, after the shuttle, I thought NASA didn't exist anymore." And so what this group is going to talk about a little bit is kind of trying to figure out the what and the why and how we can do that better maybe, and propose some ideas. And we welcome your input and questions on that. So I'm going to turn it over to Dan Storr. He is a senior media strategist at DN Storr Consulting. And Dan, take it away. Thanks.
Thanks, Jim. Good morning. As Jim said, my name's Dan Storr. I'm here with Mary and Kristen to talk about telling the story of our nation's successes in space. Let me give you a little background. I mean, who the hell am I and why the hell am I up here? In 2019, I began my own communications consulting practice. I advise clients in the aerospace and defense sector on strategic planning and communications, and how to better spread the word of what they're trying to do. In the interest of full disclosure, one of my clients is the Coalition for Deep Space Exploration. You saw Alan Cutler, their president and CEO, speak earlier this morning. I am, however, here on my own behalf, and I am not representing CDSE, so if I say something incredibly stupid, don't blame Alan. Before I hung out my own shingle, I ran the media relations practice for the Aerospace Industries Association, the largest trade association for aerospace and defense manufacturers, for the best part of a decade. And it was there that I had the opportunity to talk to a lot of people in government, in industry, and in the media about space, about the importance of the space program and driving innovation, and what comes next. And in fact, that's where Mary and I met, was at AIA. Mary, why don't you tell us a bit about yourself?
Sure. Can you hear me okay? All right. So I've been in the aerospace industry for about 20 years. It kind of pains me to say that. But so the last 10 have been at Aerojet Rocketdyne, now L3Harris, and before that I spent a decade at Ball Aerospace. And so now I lead the space communications group for the Aerojet Rocketdyne segment of L3Harris. In addition, I lead sort of a consortium of communicators from the Artemis 1 Prime, so Boeing, Lockheed, Northrop, Amentum, and then L3Harris. And so we get together every week and sort of talk about what can we do and how can we help support NASA. Very excited to be here, especially to be at Case Western. So my grandmother actually received her master's degree in sociology from Case Western during World War II. So she always talked very glowingly about her time in Cleveland and at Case Western. So it's an honor to be here.
Thanks, Mary. And next, Kristen Parker is the communications director here at NASA Glenn. Would you tell us a little bit about yourself, please?
Sure. So, unlike you two, I do not have a history in aerospace communications, but I've been communicating on behalf of government agencies for more than 20 years. First with the Department of the Army in the National Capital Region, working on media and public engagement events for senior leaders and programs. Then I moved over to the Veterans Affairs Department and worked with the National Cemetery Administration and then the Veterans Health Administration, which brought me here to Cleveland, right next door, to VA Northeast Ohio Healthcare System as their communications and external affairs chief. And they're one of the largest healthcare systems in the VA, so that was quite the challenge. And I've been at NASA for a little over 3 years now, and with the charge to try to make what we're doing a little bit more relatable and accessible.
Thanks. So my thought was to begin our little session on storytelling with a story. I'm a Navy brat. My grandfather served on a destroyer in the Pacific during World War II. My father served on a carrier in the Pacific during the Vietnam era. In fact, he was the officer of the deck on the Ticonderoga when the crew recovery missions for Apollo 16, Apollo 17, and the first crewed Skylab mission were picked up. One of my earliest memories is of visiting my great-grandmother in Cincinnati, and this was Christmas of '72, and as we were heading back out, there was a TV in the main room that was tuned to the news coverage of the Apollo 17 recovery mission. And apparently I announced to everybody on the floor, "That's my daddy's ship." So I was literally born into this world of space exploration. It's something that has formed a deep part of who I am and how I view things. So imagine my shock and confusion on learning that, as Jim said, most Americans believe NASA closed down after the space shuttle program. I mean, how was that even possible? The Uber ride in this morning, talking to the driver, and he's like, "Oh, that Artemis program, that sounds really cool. What is it?" So apparently we have some work to do. And with that in mind, let's start with NASA's communications efforts. Kristen, if you could help us with that.
Sure. At least he knew about Artemis. That's progress. So, as you can imagine, our audience is pretty broad, so we use a variety of tactics to reach folks. And in addition to industry's approach, we have that trust and transparency, that duty to the American people that we have to maintain at all times. So we do traditional methods of communication, media relations, community relations, public engagement, but we also have some of more innovative approaches. I think we're the only, maybe it's the second federal entity to have a streaming service, so NASA Plus, that's pretty different. We also have an art program that we manage, history and archives, exhibits and artifacts, speakers bureau, entertainment, guest operations and protocol. There's a lot of different components to the communications program at NASA, all geared toward trying to help us reach our audience.
What kind of stories resonate best?
So I think people are inspired by the wonder and awe, of course. So the James Webb image releases, that was huge for us. But the deeper connections, in my opinion, are made from the human element of our stories. So the people that are behind what we're doing, that connection that you can feel with your friends and neighbors. And then also when we connect our work to everyday life here. So how does it impact the audience's everyday life?
Mary, how can industry help NASA tell the story?
So, industry really complements NASA. I sort of see NASA as getting the facts out, and industry helps bring the color to the story. I think one of the ways that industry has really proven itself, though, is helping to market or sell the space program. So helping to educate, the administration on the value of different programs, helping to educate members of Congress, as well as, shareholders for industry. We have a lot of different communities that we're trying to reach. And even our employees, I always say, make sure your communications team knows what's happening, knows about your R&D program, because if the leadership doesn't understand the value of that technology you're working on, chances are they're not going to continue funding that IRAD. So make sure you're publicizing it not only externally but internally at your company as well. So I really see industry as a complement, but really taking the lead in sort of that advocacy communications, because frankly there are things that industries can say that NASA can't. And so industry can partner with other organizations like AIA and the Coalition for Deep Space Exploration, and it can help find surrogates and third parties to sort of validate and bring those stories to life as well.
So let's amplify that a little bit. What audiences are you particularly geared to reach?
I would say NASA's much more focused on the general public. However, you know, we complement them. So when I say, you know, bring that color, you know, NASA can tell you about the RS-25 engine that's going to fly on NASA's Space Launch System, and it can tell you, you know, it's 500,000 pounds of thrust. Industry can tell you about the history of the engine, what astronauts previously flew on those engines, and so sort of add that color commentary to there. You know, I think about with Glenn, we're working on the Advanced Electric Propulsion System. So again, you know, Glenn does a great job of telling you about the APS, why these 12 kilowatt thrusters are the next thing since sliced bread. You know, we can tell you again about the human element, the chief engineer that is building it. You know, yes, she has a PhD in nuclear fission, but, you know, she took an intro class on electric propulsion and said, that's what I want to do. I'm excited about electric propulsion. And so, you know, to tell that human element, I think both of us can do a good job telling that human story. And we have a different perspective with that. But in terms of the audiences, I think, you know, our audiences are much more the stakeholders versus the general public.
Kristen, any response?
I'm going to learn how to do this after. I wonder, it's getting me thinking, in addition to the human element, what are your thoughts, Mary, about industry telling the story of how NASA has helped enable them?
Yeah, no, I think industry's doing a lot to partner with NASA. You know, one of the things that we're doing with the Artemis program is we're trying to get out into the communities with NASA. So, you know, during the Apollo program, there was like the 50 states campaign where they brought the Apollo 11 command module to all of the capitals and, you know, really brought that element to the people. So the people were able to connect with the mission. And I think, you know, 800,000 Ohioans went to see, you know, the command module. And so you talk about ROI and figuring out where you can maximize, you know, the return and impact the most people. So right now with, you know, following the Artemis 1 mission, we really went out to our communities where our suppliers were. So that's the one thing. Industry has a connection with the supply chain that NASA doesn't. It has, but not the direct connection that industry has. And so trying to get out into those communities. So just like 2 weeks ago, I was in Seattle, Washington, meeting with our suppliers, but then leveraging onto there a community event. So making the community understand what's going on, adding in a media component. So that way you understand they're telling the story, they're amplifying the story to the local community. And so we are working hard with NASA to make sure we get to different communities, different pockets, because the country's a big place. We're not all reading Life magazine like they were during the Apollo program. And so, you know, it's a challenge, but, you know, trying to partner with NASA to really broaden that story as much as possible.
Actually, that brings up a point. There's a thread developing here. People aren't reading Life magazine anymore. My experiences growing up with NASA were all on network TV. And there's a very fractured communications environment that we're now dealing with, which is a very different thing. Network news doesn't exist the same way that it used to. It doesn't have the same reach. I wonder if there are different platforms that we need to be exploring to reach the general public. I mean, how are we broadening the aperture?
That's a great question, and it's shocking to me to see that people aren't watching the news, that some people are actually getting all of their news from TikTok, which we aren't even on. So we are looking at that and saying, okay, how do we change what we're doing? I think we need to continue to make our work relatable and focus on that value, but do it in a way that provides context depending on the audience that we're trying to reach. So I use the with them, like what's in it for me, but how do we use that for our audience? A lot of times people try to use the same message for every single platform. You create a video because you think it's the best video ever, but did you have the platform in mind? Probably not. Now, yes. Making sure that we're using plain language, making sure that we're just really thinking about the message and the audience and how do we tie it together. I think that's super helpful. We're also using some of those innovative tools to broaden the aperture. So with NASA Plus and the streaming service, since it launched, we also have gone on to have partnerships with other streaming platforms to show our content and to get that information out there. So that's just one example.
Too, Dan. But you're absolutely right. You know, we are more segmented now than we ever were, you know, and we're competing with multiple voices and attention. And it's a 24-hour news cycle, so it's a larger hurdle. I will say NASA's done an amazing job reaching out to a lot of different partnerships and really helping getting the message out. I think for industry, you know, we really have to try to meet the public where they are. And so, you know, embrace social media, embrace those non-traditional outlets. You know, right now, my team's really making a focus on podcasts. You know, we haven't really done podcasts in the past. And so trying to make sure we're meeting the public where they're going. If they're going to the podcast to get their news, well, then let's go get on those podcasts. You mentioned TikTok. We're not on TikTok either. But I will say, a lot of the American public is on TikTok. So my challenge to anybody in this audience, is anybody in the audience on TikTok? Okay, we got a couple. So my challenge to you is help us tell the story of NASA on TikTok. You know, NASA's got a great media gallery, nasa.gov, go to /multimedia. There's tons of imageries, tons of videos. Help us tell the story on TikTok, because we definitely are missing that audience, and so we need to get there. The other thing is, one of the things we're trying to do is leverage our employees to also be brand ambassadors. So give our employees the tools that they need. So give them the infographics, give them the messaging, so that way they can also help get out to the public and share that message. You know, like I said, you know, NASA, I think, has the lead on the general public and the engagement with them. But it's incumbent on all of us. You know, we all have to tell the American taxpayer, you know, the amazing things that are happening because we are going. And if we weren't going, these amazing things would not be happening.
Yeah. Brand ambassador is a communications technical term.
Oh, sorry.
And it means anybody who's telling your story. And there's no such thing as too many brand ambassadors, ever. The more people you have telling the story, the more you get a critical mass, the better your story gets out there. Let's shift focus a little bit. What stories, Mary? You were mentioned the public work that you did, and what I'm wondering is what part of the story resonated most, and what was successful about that?
You know, I think everybody loves an emotional story. Everybody loves an underdog story. But as Krista mentioned, it's that human story, you know, humanizing, you know, the technology, humanizing the people. People want to relate. They want to understand. They want to find their place in the story. And so I think the more we can do to tell that human aspect, you know, when we go out into the community, we'll do these community events, and we'll try to have a diverse panel of folks, you know, so we'll try to have an engineer, but in addition, you know, we'll try to have a young professional, and, you know, we really want the young professional to help tell the students, you know, there's a place for you, you know, and occasionally, you know, we'll have a tradesperson come and talk about, you know, the trades, welding, electricity, you know, we need all the trades to be successful. And so I think really showing there's a place for everybody, and to make that human connection is really important when we go out into our communities. And I really do think those stories relate much more than just, it's cool technology. Yes, we're going to the moon, but, you know, when you have that cool story about the person, you know, that's what folks want to hear and listen to.
Mm-hmm. NASA plays a incredibly vital role in R&D and turning the things that are driven by the space program into everyday impacts on the American public. I mean, we've all told the story of the cell phone that's got more computing power than the Atlas rocket did when we were launching Apollo. Kristen, can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. I like this one.
Softball.
So actually, my colleagues and I from the research centers have been talking a lot about this recently. And it's how do you tell that story of the research and how do you make a connection? Because when I think about, I use my parents as an example. My dad worked on the railroad for 40 plus years, retired from the railroad. My mom has worked in retail. They're both retired. When we go back to the moon, while they will think it's cool and it's oh yeah, that's great, I don't know that they will understand why or that it resonates. I mean, they will because I'll be telling them why it resonates. But if you take that, multiply it by thousands, millions. So I think the more that we can tell the research and development story and the full life cycle of a mission, the better. And we've talked internally within NASA about how that research and development is the direct link. So a couple examples of how to do that. So the power systems that we're actively talking about for the moon. So that's going to impact areas here that don't have reliable power or when there's a disaster. The AI assisted monitoring for astronauts when we go further away without doctors. How's that going to help? Well, virtual telemedicine, monitoring in home. We just did a story a couple of months ago on technology at Glenn that was developed at least 20 years ago and tested on the International Space Station, and that life cycle, it's just now getting into in-home use. So the more that we can make the connection to the full life cycle of the mission, including that research and development, which is the direct connection, I think will help people understand more why it's important.
Okay. The last question I have is, how do we measure success? That's always the critical element when you're in a communications campaign. It's not only designing the plan and executing on the plan, but then you do an after action and try to assess, okay, what went right, what went wrong, what can we do better? What can we do better? How do we measure that? Any ideas?
Well, I think, for industry, because we are really trying to reach a lot of stakeholders and make sure there's continuity of funding for these programs, ultimately, we can measure by, is the program being funded? So that's one result of, do you know if you're being successful? But then sort of on the communications front, when you write a press release, are the quotes being picked up? Are the storylines being picked up? So you can, of course, measure that. I think also, when you're having these events, how many people are coming? So you can measure how many folks are coming as well. In social media, I love social media because there's so many metrics already built into the amplification, the retweet, so instantly, is that story trending or not. Again, TikTok, I'm not on it, so I don't know how to tell if we're doing well there, but I'm challenging, the lady over there that's on it to help tell our story and amplify the message.
Throughout my career, the question of how do you tell if you're being successful in communications has been a struggle, because unlike in the private sector, we can't sit there and do surveys as easily as everyone else, and we're not looking at a bottom line. So it's not, if we sold this many widgets, we know that we've done a great job. So it is a little bit more challenging. We do have metrics from our different media engagements and our social media and digital media, and it's astronomical numbers. But you look at the numbers and you connect it to research studies, a recent one with Pew that was saying that people still don't completely understand what NASA's doing. So you can't necessarily say that having almost as many followers or more than Beyonce is equating to people actually understanding what you do. So it is a constant challenge to figure that out. But what I think we can see is when NASA and Artemis become a part of the national conversation, when you see not just trending per se for us, but when you actually see people understanding and talking about it, or when you see your influencers that are taking that message and then people are generating their own content that's correct and accurate, I think those are things that you can tell. I wish that it was a little bit more scientific for us, while we don't lobby, I guess we can see it with the funding as well. Because as more people understand the connection and the value we provide, then more support and advocacy for us happens. So yeah, it's a tough one, but it's a good one to continue to evaluate and address.
Okay. I guess at this point, any questions from the audience? Going once, going twice? Well, Jim, I guess we'll yield back the rest of our time and send you all off to lunch.